Hello friends, this video is on the concepts of preload and afterload, particularly on the cardiac muscle. It is in two parts. The first part we will discuss the concept of load and the effects of preload and afterload on skeletal and cardiac muscle. And in the part 2, we will see the effects of these loads on the left ventricular pressure volume loops. So don't miss to watch the second video also. And of course, towards the end, we will also have Physio Plus Plus, the new section that we have added in every video, where there is extension of the physio in the various other subjects like patho, pharmac, medicine, etc. And writing that will give you extra marks in the exams. So that being said, now let's start with the first part, starting with the basics, that is the concept of load. This phrase is used in common language also routinely. I mean, somebody says I'm carrying a lot of load on my shoulders, probably referring to the weight being carried. Or in the corporate world, corporate culture, there is concept of workload. So some kind of burden is being expressed by the term load. In human physiology, the load refers to the burden itself, but let's see how the muscles tackle this burden. So load is, for example, weightlifters, they lift the weight, it's a load. Load being moved to a certain distance. So when a muscle contracts, it displaces the load through a certain distance. Point number one. Load is applied to the muscle, and when the muscle begins to contract, it starts displacing the load and it moves that load through a certain distance. So work is also being done. The other point that you must understand is that load is the opposing factor. Load opposes the muscle contraction. As the contraction starts, the load will oppose the contraction, and therefore the strength of contraction will decrease. Note this point. And greater the load, greater will be the opposition to the contraction, and strength of contraction will go on decreasing. All right. Whether it's a skeletal muscle, isolated muscle preparation where you apply the load and contraction strength decreases, or even in the case of heart muscle. Now you might say that greater the load, greater the weight, we produce stronger contraction strength increases to move that load. Yes, that's right, but that is done consciously, voluntarily. By a conscious effort, we recruit more and more motor units into the contraction if there is a heavier load to be displaced. So it's a conscious effort that we produce a stronger contraction. Why do we need to do that? It's because a greater load means a greater opposition to the contraction, and it will decrease the strength of contraction. So load opposes the contraction. This needs to be clearly understood. Now, types of load. Basically, every load is said to be an afterload. What is meant by an afterload? After the muscle contraction begins, the load starts opposing the contraction, and that means it starts acting on the muscle, it starts opposing the muscle contraction, and therefore it is called as an afterload. All right, and that means essentially every load is an afterload. Every load is an afterload. Why? Because after the muscle contraction starts, the muscle has to displace that load. Load starts opposing the contraction after the contraction begins, and therefore every load is essentially the afterload. Some types of load, on the other hand, are called as preload. Pre means before. So it means before the contraction started. Load started acting on the muscle before its contraction started. That would be called as preload. Let's take an example. Here is a bucket, let's say a bucket on the ground. It's heavy, it's a heavy load. Lift the bucket from the ground and let it be unsupported. You are holding it but it's unsupported. This load stretches your biceps. Can you imagine this? The load has started acting on the biceps. It is stretching the biceps. Biceps contraction has not yet started. You are not contracting the biceps yet. Just holding the load like that above the ground, and it started acting on the biceps. It started stretching the biceps. So it started acting on the muscle even in its relaxed state, even in before the contraction started. Therefore, it is called as preload. All right. And then also note, once you start contracting the biceps, you are anyways displacing that load. Load is anyways going to oppose the contraction. Load is acting on the muscle after the contraction starts also, and therefore the preload will continue as the afterload later on. Okay. But the cardinal difference between these two, when you say afterload, it strictly means after the contraction started, the load started acting on the muscle. And preload means load is acting on the muscle even before the contraction started. In the case of skeletal muscle, muscle was in a relaxed state and the load started acting on it. It stretched that muscle in its relaxed state. And when the contraction starts, even if it was a preload, as the contraction begins, load will oppose that contraction anyways. So afterload will continue. All right. As I said, all loads are essentially the afterloads. Some are also preloads, that is, they act before the contraction started. Now this was about the skeletal muscle. Let's come to the heart muscle, which is what is the topic of discussion. Heart muscle also has these two types of load, the preload and the afterload. Let's understand the preload. Preload on the heart muscle or ventricular muscle fiber. Look, ventricular muscle fiber or myocardium or heart muscle is alternately going into systole, diastole, systole, diastole, systole, diastole. Systole means contraction. All right. It's the systolic contraction which will eject the blood out. But what is happening before the systolic contraction starts? This is it's the diastole of the previous cardiac cycle, isn't it? Before the systolic contraction begins, what is going on in the heart? Diastole of the previous cardiac cycle. So preload on the heart is end diastolic volume. It is indicated by the end diastolic volume. Why is that? It's because, as we said, preload means the load started acting on the muscle before its contraction started. In the case of heart muscle, its contraction is systolic contraction, and before that systolic contraction, what was happening? Previous cardiac cycles, diastole was happening. Blood was filling in the ventricles. So as the blood fills in the ventricles are relaxing, the ventricular muscle fiber expands, and therefore the muscle is stretched, and then with the next systole it has to eject out that amount of blood which was filled during previous diastole. So end diastolic volume refers to the preload. Let's expand it further. Greater the end diastolic volume, let me just also define it quickly. What is end diastolic volume? Volume of blood in the ventricles by the end of the diastole. And then the next systole starts and the blood will be ejected out. Well, now greater the end diastolic volume, that means greater will be the filling of the ventricles, isn't it? Greater will be the stretch of the ventricular muscle fibers. And since it was a greater filling during the previous diastole, with next systole, the heart will have to eject out that extra amount of blood. Therefore, the load on the heart has increased. Preload has increased. Why? Because end diastolic volume was greater, ventricles were filled with greater amount of blood, and therefore they need to eject out that extra amount of blood. So workload of the ventricle has increased. That's the concept of preload on the heart. Just remember, preload is reflected by the end diastolic volume. What about the afterload? Now, after the contraction starts, ventricular contraction starts, it has to eject out the blood. Now, it is facing the pressure of the vessels. It has to overcome those pressures. It has to overcome the pressure in the vessel and eject out the blood. And therefore, afterload, by definition, is the load against which the ventricle is contracting. I repeat once again, what is afterload? The load against which the ventricle is contracting. In the face of that pressure in the vessels, the ventricle has to eject out the blood. So that is called as afterload. After the contraction started, it is facing the pressure in the vessels, and in the face of that pressure, ventricle has to eject out the blood. So that is the afterload. During the contraction or after the contraction has started, it is facing that load. Now look at the afterload. Let's compare the ventricles. Right ventricle ejects the blood into the pulmonary artery. So pulmonary artery pressure is the afterload for the right ventricle. Right ventricle is facing the pulmonary artery pressure, and during systole it has to eject the blood by overcoming that pressure. In the case of left ventricle is facing the aorta pressure, and therefore afterload on the left ventricle will be the aorta pressure in the aorta. So that's the preload and afterload on the ventricles. Extending the comparison further, preload is same on both ventricles. Now note this point. Preload is same on both ventricles. Why? Because same amount of blood fills in both ventricles. End diastolic volume for both ventricles is almost the same. Left ventricle receives some 1 or 2 extra % of blood, which is of bronchial circulation, but left ventricle is able to accommodate that blood without allowing the load to rise. So therefore, we may say that end diastolic volume is almost the same, and therefore preload is almost the same on both ventricles. But afterload is different. Afterload on the left ventricle is almost 5 to 7 times greater compared to the afterload of the right ventricle. It's easy to understand. Pulmonary artery pressure 25 mm of Hg. Aorta pressure 125 mm of Hg. 25, 125. That means the left ventricle is facing a 5 times greater pressure. That is the pressure of the aorta. And therefore, afterload on the left ventricle is 5 to 7 times greater as compared to afterload on the right ventricle. So that was the comparison between the two ventricles. And therefore also remember, work output by the left ventricle is also said to be 5 to 7 times higher as compared to work output of the right ventricle. That's because the load is higher load through which the blood is being moved or ejected out, and therefore work output by the left ventricle is 5 to 7 times greater. Now the comparison is over. Let's only talk about the left ventricle. Keep the comparison behind now of the right and left ventricle. Now I am talking only about the left ventricle here. Next point, that is, increased preload increases the stroke volume, but increased afterload decreases the stroke volume. Repeat this in your mind. Increased preload increases the stroke volume. Increased afterload will decrease the stroke volume of the left ventricle. Why is that? Let's understand. Increased preload increases the stroke volume. Reason or explanation is Frank-Starling law. Frank-Starling law is the explanation. You know the Starling's law for the skeletal muscle. What does it say? Greater the initial length, stronger is the contraction within physiological limits. Within physiological limits, greater the initial length, stronger is the contraction. Its extension in the heart is called as Frank-Starling law. Greater the venous return, greater is the end diastolic volume, greater will be the stroke volume and cardiac output. More the venous return, more is the stroke volume and cardiac output. It's more or less the same law. I mean, more the venous return and more is the ventricular filling, more will be the end diastolic volume. Means more blood in the blood filled in the ventricles by the end of the diastole, which means diastolic fiber length, end diastolic fiber length will be that much greater. I have made another video, you can refer to that video talking about the end diastolic volume, preload and Frank-Starling law. But it's easy to understand. During the previous cardiac cycle, diastole happened, more amount of blood is filled during that diastole. That means ventricular fiber length was increased that much more. And that length becomes the initial length for the next systole. So, next systole will be that much powerful, it will eject out more amount of blood, stroke volume will increase. So, increased preload will increase the stroke volume by Frank-Starling law. But you might say, so this is good, more the preload, more will be the stroke volume. This is a good thing to happen, stroke volume is increasing. No, you are forgetting. Within physiological limits. This can happen only within physiological limits. After all, heart has got a limited capacity, it's a limited chamber. So it cannot go on increasing the stroke volume forever, isn't it? And therefore, but up to certain physiological limit, if the preload increases, stroke volume also increases. Beyond that, the stroke volume will not increase, it will even, in fact, even fall. Well, what about afterload? If there is increased afterload, now the ventricle, the left ventricle has a greater resistance to face. It is facing a greater load against which it has to pump the stroke volume. So what happens is, if the aorta pressure and artery pressure increases, the stroke volume will decrease. So that's the effect of load on the left ventricular contraction and systolic ejection. Finally, let's talk about the Physio++. What is the application of all of this in our understanding of pharmacology or medicine? Look, there are certain conditions like heart failure, right-sided heart failure or hypertension or such conditions in which you need to decide which drug is to be given. And you have to make choice between a venodilator drug or an arterial dilating drug. So, understand this. When you need to decrease the preload on the heart, you give venodilator drug. For instance, the conditions like right-sided heart failure or the conditions in which you need to decrease the preload on the heart, you will give venodilator drug. Why is that? A venodilator drug means the drug that dilates the veins primarily. Venous dilation would mean that the blood will be pooled in the veins. More and more blood will be pooled. There will be pooling of blood in the veins, which means venous return to the heart will decrease because blood is getting pooled in the veins. So blood returning to the heart will be less. That means venous return to the heart will be less, would mean decrease in the end diastolic volume, decrease in the ventricular filling, and therefore the preload will decrease. So venodilators, when you want to decrease the preload. And arterial dilators are the drugs that will decrease the afterload. Now you can understand this. Arterial dilators, they decrease the pressure in the arteries, and you know, we have seen that the aorta pressure and the artery pressure is the afterload against which the ventricle, left ventricle, is contracting. So if that pressure decreases by giving arterial dilator, then the afterload will decrease. So that was the first part of this particular concept of preload and afterload on the heart. In the next video, we will be talking about the left ventricular pressure volume changes with preload and afterload. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and you get regular updates and regular videos.